The snarl was a blade of sound in the cold stone kennel. It had broken 3 fingers and drawn blood twice. The king's finest healers, men accustomed to stitching limbs back onto knights, flinched from the furious 50-pound body of the shade wolf pup. It was all teeth and terror, its left foreleg mangled from a trap on the northern marches, the metal teeth of which now lay in a discarded bucket, rusted with old blood and new. The pup, Cal, was a gift to the Lord Commander, a living sigil of the crown's favor, and it was dying of fury and infection in the heart of the citadel. And the Lord Commander watched. He did not move from his position by the heavy oak door, a figure carved from the same oppressive silence as the shadows that clung to the corners of the room. Lord Commander Caius did not command the wolf. He did not soothe it. He simply stood, his presence a weight that made the air thick and hard to breathe. The healers had failed. The kennel master was bleeding, and Ilara, who was meant to be cleaning the drains, sat on the floor and did nothing. She had entered with a bucket and a brush, her head bowed as was expected, her presence as negligible as a mouse in the rafters. She had seen the panic, the thrashing, the raw wound, the darker stain of fear in the eyes of the men. She had set her bucket down, the gentle clatter of a wooden bucket on stone. And then she had slid down the wall to sit on the damp, cold flagstones, her knees drawn up to her chest. She did not look at the pup. She looked at a loose thread on the cuff of her drab tunic, her focus absolute. She did not reach for it once. The kennel fell quiet, the only sounds the ragged, pained breaths of the pup and the distant, rhythmic clang of the armory smiths. Minutes stretched, each one a taut wire. The pup's growling subsided, replaced by a low, suspicious whine. It watched her, its good eye, the color of molten gold, fixed on her stillness. She offered it nothing. No cooing words, no tempting morsel of meat, no outstretched hand. She was simply a fact in the room, as present and as undemanding as a stone. And the lack of demand was a language it understood better than any command. Slowly, painfully, it began to move, a drag of its hindquarters, a hitched, agonizing pull of its wounded shoulder. It left a faint, wet smear of blood on the stone as it closed the 10 feet between them. The Lord Commander hadn't moved, but Ilara felt the intensity of his gaze shift from the pup to her. It was a physical pressure, more unnerving than the pup's teeth. Call reached her, collapsed against her leg with a final shuddering sigh, and laid its head in her lap. Silence, utter, profound, and terrifying. Ilara finally lifted her head, her gaze meeting the Lord Commander's across the now-still room. His face was unreadable, a mask of cold control, but his eyes held a terrifying, razor-sharp focus. He had not seen a kennel warden. He had seen a weapon he did not understand. He moved then, his boots making no sound on the stone. He was a wraith in the black uniform of his station, all lean muscle and disciplined quiet. The surviving healer and the kennel master scurried out of the room like startled rats, leaving the 3 of them alone in the echoing space. Caius stopped a few feet from her, his shadow swallowing her whole. The pup in her lap did not stir, its breathing already evening out into the rhythms of exhausted sleep. How? His voice was low, devoid of inflection. It wasn't a question born of curiosity. It was an accusation. "I did nothing," Ilara said, her own voice rough from disuse. She kept her hands resting on her knees, not touching the pup, not daring to claim it. It chose. His gaze was dissecting. He looked at her plain, worn face, the calluses on her hands, the utter lack of anything that would mark her as special. She was an Omega by designation, a relic of a caste system that had been officially dismantled, but persisted in the bones of the citadel. Unlanded, unbonded, unimportant, less than nothing. "It is the king's gift," he stated. "Its life is my responsibility." The unspoken threat hung in the air between them. And now, so are you. "You will tend to it," he said. It was not a request. "Here." He gestured vaguely at the small, windowless antechamber used for storing feed. It was a cell. She was being moved from the anonymous squalor of the lower kennels to this focused, observable confinement. She was no longer a servant. She was an instrument. She gave a single, shallow nod. Her gaze dropped to the pup, its black fur surprisingly soft against her rough-spun trousers. Its wounded leg was a mess of torn flesh and splintered bone, smelling of rot and pain. She would need clean water, linen, and hog's bristle thread. She would need a knife, sharp and sterile. She did not ask for these things. She waited. He seemed to read the inventory in her silence. "What you require will be provided." He turned to leave, his presence receding like a tide. At the door, he paused. "If it dies," he said, his back still to her, "so does the king's favor for me. See that you remember that." A heavy door closing, the bolt scraping home. The sound sealed her in. She was alone with the Lord Commander's wounded heart, and it was sleeping in her lap. The weight of it was unbearable. She finally allowed her hand to move, her fingers sinking into the thick fur of the pup's neck, feeling the fragile, frantic pulse beneath. She had been invisible for 10 years. It was how she had survived. Now she had been seen. She was not sure she would survive it. The antechamber was as cold as he had promised. A cot, a bucket, and a single tallow candle were her only furnishings. But true to his word, the supplies arrived. A basin of steaming water, clean linen, a small jar of silver salve, and a roll of gut sutures. They were left outside her door by a silent guard, the transaction as impersonal as a prison meal. Kyle, the pup, watched her with his one good eye as she meticulously cleaned and set the broken bones of his leg. He whimpered when she pulled the splinters free, but he did not snap. He licked her hand once, a rough, hot rasp of his tongue against her knuckles, and then lay still, trusting her. She worked with a slow, practiced efficiency that felt like a memory from another life. A life before the kennels, before the fall. A life where her hands had been taught finer things than scrubbing floors. When she was done, the pup's leg was tightly bound in a splint, the wound clean and stitched. She sat back on her heels, the candle flame dancing in the draft from under the door, casting her shadow long and distorted against the stone wall. That was when he came. The bolt slid back without a sound, and the door opened. Lord Commander Caius stood there, a silhouette against the torchlight of the corridor. He didn't enter, merely filled the doorway. He was not checking on the pup. She knew that with a certainty that chilled her to the bone. He was checking on her. His gaze swept the room, taking in the neat stitches, the sleeping pup, and her, kneeling on the floor. He said nothing. The silence stretched, a conversation held in the space between heartbeats. She did not speak. She did not rise. She met his gaze and held it, her own stillness a mirror to his. It was a battle of attrition. Who would look away first? Who would fill the void with a useless word? She had learned long ago that the person who speaks first in a silent room is the one who is most afraid. She would not be that person. He held a small, leather-wrapped bundle in his hand. After a full minute of silent observation, He stepped inside, placed the bundle on the edge of her cot, and retreated back to the doorway. The sound of something being set down carefully. Inside the bundle were 2 loaves of bread, a wedge of hard cheese, and a small, dark bottle of wine. It was not servant's fare. He left as silently as he had arrived, the bolt sliding home once more. Elara stared at the food, her stomach twisting. It was not kindness. It was maintenance. He was tending to his new, strange tool, ensuring it was sharp and functional. She broke off a piece of bread, the crust hard, the inside soft. As she ate, she watched the pup sleep, its flank rising and falling in a steady rhythm. He had brought her food, but his presence had been the real offering, a stark, unnerving reminder that she was his, a possession, a secret. And the citadel was full of men who would kill for the Lord Commander's secrets. The visits became a ritual. Every evening, after the citadel had settled into the quiet rhythms of the night, the bolt on her door would slide back. Caius would appear, sometimes with food, sometimes with fresh linen for the pup's dressings, sometimes with nothing at all. He would stand in the doorway, or just inside it, and watch. He watched her change the pup's bandage, his eyes tracking the economical movements of her hands. He watched her as she sat and mended a tear in her own tunic, the needle, a tiny silver fish darting through the rough cloth. He watched her do nothing at all, simply sitting with the pup curled at her feet. They rarely spoke. The silence in the small room was a living thing, thick with unspoken questions and unoffered answers. Elara learned the nuances of his stillness. The slight tension in his jaw meant the king was displeased. The way his hand rested on the pommel of his longsword meant there was trouble brewing in the council. She was reading him the way she had once read the weather in the sky, a skill for survival. One evening, a man she recognized as Chancellor Valerius appeared at her door instead. He was the opposite of Caius in every way. Where Caius was cold, hard lines and silence, Valerius was soft curves, expensive fabrics, and a voice like warm, spiced wine. He smiled at her, a practiced, charming expression that did not reach his eyes. "The kennel warden with the magic touch," he said, his tone light and condescending. "The entire citadel speaks of you." Carl, who had been dozing, lifted his head and emitted a low, guttural growl from deep in his chest. Valerius's smile tightened. My protective. He took a step into the room, his perfumed scent an invasion in the clean, sterile air. "The Lord Commander values his assets. I trust he is rewarding your unique talents." The question was a probe, digging for the nature of her connection to Caius. Elara kept her expression placid. "The commander is my lord. I serve at his pleasure." It was a meaningless, deferential phrase, and it gave him nothing. "Of course," Valerius murmured, his eyes flicking around the sparse room. "Still, a gift like yours, to calm the untamable. One wonders where you acquired it. Such things are not taught." Just then, the air in the corridor seemed to drop 10 degrees. Caius was there, standing behind the chancellor. He hadn't made a sound, but his presence was a physical force. Valerius turned, his charming mask faltering for a fraction of a second. "Lord Commander," he said, recovering smoothly, "I was just congratulating your good fortune. This young woman is a marvel." Caius's gaze was fixed on Elara. It was cold, possessive. "The Chancellor has business elsewhere," he said, his voice flat. It was a dismissal as sharp as a beheading. Valerius's smile was a sickly thing now. He gave a slight bow, his eyes lingering on Elara for a moment too long, a look that promised future trouble. Then he was gone. Kaya stepped into the room, closing the door behind him. The pup's growl subsided. "Do not speak to him again?" Caius ordered. "I do not," she replied quietly. "He speaks to me." For the first time, a flicker of something other than control crossed his face. It looked like frustration. It looked like concern. It was gone in an instant. "See that you have nothing to say." He turned and left, leaving her with the lingering, cloying scent of the Chancellor and the cold, clean fear of the commander. She was caught between two crushing stones, and the space was getting smaller every day. That night, a storm broke over the citadel. Rain lashed against the high stone walls, and the wind howled through the battlements like a hungry ghost. Inside her cell-like room, the sounds were muted, but the oppressive atmosphere seeped through the stones. Kyle was restless. He whimpered in his sleep, his legs twitching, his body trembling. He was dreaming of the trap, of the searing pain and the terror. Ilara moved from her cot to the floor, stroking his back, her voice a low, meaningless murmur. "Shh, you're safe. It's over." She wasn't sure if she was talking to the pup or to herself. The bolt on her door slid back. She didn't startle. She had come to expect him. Kaya stood in the doorway, not in his severe black uniform, but in a simple linen shirt and dark trousers. His hair was damp, as if he'd been walking the ramparts in the rain. He looked younger without the armor, and more dangerous. The rigid control was stripped away, leaving something raw and watchful in its place. He watched her for a long moment, her hand moving in slow, steady circles on the pup's trembling flank. He didn't speak. He just watched, his stillness a stark contrast to the storm raging outside and the phantom one playing out in the pup's mind. The whimpering subsided. Kyle pressed closer to her, his breathing deepening again. Ilara rested her cheek on her drawn-up knees, her eyes on the flickering candle. The silence in the room was different tonight. Less a battlefield, more a shared space, a shelter. "It was not a skirmish," he said, his voice so low she almost missed it. The words dropped into the quiet room like stones into a deep well. She didn't look at him. She didn't need to. She knew what he was saying. A border skirmish was an accident of proximity, a clash of patrols. Kyle's injury, the loss of the men on that patrol, it was something else. It was an ambush, a deliberate act. It was betrayal, seeded from within the citadel's own walls. The kind of betrayal that benefited a man like Chancellor Valerius, who sought to undermine the Lord Commander's authority in the Northern Territories. She said nothing. She offered no theories, no condolences. She simply accepted the weight of his words, letting them settle beside her in the dark. It was the first piece of himself he had ever offered her. Not a command, not an observation, but a confession, a shard of the truth he carried alone. He stood there for another minute, perhaps two. Then, without another word, he closed the door, leaving her in the dark with the sleeping pup and the terrible knowledge of the viper coiled in the king's council. The storm outside raged on, but the true danger was the quiet poison spreading through the heart of their world. Kyle's leg healed. The limp became a faint favoring, then disappeared entirely. The pup was a shadow at Ilara's heels, a sleek, silent presence of black fur and golden eyes. Caius began to require her presence outside the room. "The pup needs to be trained to the sense of the upper citadel," he would say, his voice flat, the excuse transparent. They would walk the high battlements, the wind whipping her plain dress around her legs, the whole of the city sprawling below them. Kyle would trot ahead, nose to the ground, a perfect picture of a wolf returning to its strength. It was on these walks that she confirmed her theory. Whenever they passed a guardsman loyal to Valerius, or when the conversation, sparse as it was, drifted toward court politics, Caius's hand would move. It was an almost imperceptible motion, his fingers brushing against, then gripping, the worn leather of his sword's hilt. It wasn't a threat. It was an anchor, a tell. He was a man holding himself back from a precipice, and the effort was a constant, draining strain. She learned to read the city through him. The tension in his shoulders told her more than any court gossip. One evening, as the sun bled orange and purple across the horizon, they stood looking out over the northern plains. Kyle was chasing a moth near the merlins. "Valerius believes you are a witch," Caius said, not looking at her. "He believes you have ensorcelled the pup, and through it, me." "And what do you believe?" she asked, her voice quiet against the wind. He turned to face her then. His eyes were dark, searching. "I believe you sat on the floor." It was the most profound thing he had ever said to her. It was an acknowledgement of the truth she had offered, an absence of demand, a quiet patience that had conquered what force could not. He reached inside his tunic and pulled out a knife. It was not a courtly dagger, jeweled and ornate. It was a soldier's knife, the blade a hand's length of dark, honed steel, the handle wrapped in simple, practical leather. He held it out to her, hilt first. "The kennels taught you to be overlooked," he said. "Do not let the citadel teach you to be helpless." It was not a gift. It was a statement. "I see you. I know you are not what you seem." She took it. Her fingers closed around the worn leather handle. The weight was perfect, the balance precise. It felt like an extension of her own arm. She did not thank him. The exchange was beyond thanks. It was a pact, sealed in the cold evening air, witnessed only by a wolf pup and a dying son. She slid the knife into a hidden sheath she had sewn into the seam of her dress years ago. He saw the movement, and a flicker of something, not surprise but confirmation, passed through his eyes. They stood in silence as darkness consumed the sky, two solitary figures on the edge of a war that had not yet been declared. The trap was sprung with chilling precision. It did not come with soldiers and drawn swords, but with whispers and carefully placed words in the king's ear. Chancellor Valerius, his face a mask of grave concern, presented his case to the royal council. He spoke of unnatural influence, of the Lord Commander's increasing isolation. He spoke of the Omega Girl with the strange power over beasts, a power that bordered on the forbidden arts. He suggested that Caius, broken by the skirmish that had cost him his men, was now relying on this woman's dark talents to forge the pup, a royal gift into a personal weapon, an assassin loyal only to him. It was a masterful stroke, twisting Alara's quiet care into a sinister plot and Caius's trust into a treasonous conspiracy. The proof was circumstantial, yet damning in its presentation. The commander's nightly visits, the food he brought her, the knife he had given her. Each act of guarded intimacy was reframed as an act of sedition. The citadel turned on them overnight. The guards who had nodded to her on the battlements now looked through her, their faces hard. The whispers followed her like carrion birds. The commander's witch. Blood magic! She was moved from her antechamber to a true cell in the lower dungeons, the air thick with damp and despair. This time, there was no pretense. She was a prisoner, a key piece of evidence in the case against the Lord Commander. "Caius," she heard from a sympathetic jailer, was confined to his quarters, stripped of his command, pending the king's judgment. Valerius was acting Lord Commander now. The viper was in charge of the nest. In the cold, damp dark of her cell, Alara sat with her back against the weeping stone wall. Fear was a cold knot in her stomach, but beneath it, something else was hardening into a point of pure, cold rage. They had underestimated her. Valerius, the council, the king. They saw a kennel warden, a pawn, a victim. They had never once considered that she might be a player. She thought of Caius, alone in his rooms, caged by lies. She thought of his stillness, the silent weight of the command he carried, the way he had looked at her and seen not a witch, but a woman who sat on the floor. He had given her a knife and told her not to be helpless. It was time to prove him right. Her hand went to the hidden sheath in her dress. The knife was still there. They hadn't thought to search a simple Omega girl that thoroughly. Their underestimation was her greatest weapon. Her choice was simple. She could disappear. She knew the Citadel's secret ways, the forgotten tunnels and cisterns that honeycombed the rock beneath the fortress. She could be a ghost by morning, lost in the sprawling city beyond the walls, and survive. Or she could stay. She could fight. Not for the king, who listened to poison, or the council, who saw only what they were shown, but for the man who saw her. The man who was currently being dismantled by the same lie that had imprisoned her. It was not about saving him. He was not a man who could be saved. It was about rectifying an injustice. It was about balance. Survival was not enough. Not this time. She waited until the deepest point of the night, when the guards changed and the citadel slept its most profound sleep. The lock on her cell was old and simple. The tip of Caius's knife, when applied with the right pressure to the pins, was better than a key, a faint metallic click. She was out, a ghost in the dungeons. She moved through the shadows she knew so well. Her target was not the armory, nor the king's chambers. It was the chancellor's private records office. Valerius was a creature of information. His cruelty was precise, documented. He would have kept records. A man like that could not resist admiring his own cleverness on paper. She found it in a locked folio, tucked away behind a false panel in his desk. It wasn't a confession. It was better. It was the original dispatch order for the patrol that had been ambushed. And beside it, a private ledger detailing a transfer of gold to a known mercenary captain in the northern marches, dated 2 days before the attack. The payment was for clearing the way. Valerius had not only orchestrated the ambush to weaken Caius, he had paid to have the king's soldiers murdered to do it. She took only the ledger page. It was all she needed. Getting to Caius's quarters was the final, most dangerous part. His rooms were heavily guarded by men loyal to Valerius. She did not try to fight them or sneak past them. She walked into the torchlight of the corridor and stopped. The guards leveled their spears. "I have a message for the prisoner," she said, her voice calm. They laughed. "The witch wants to see her master." She held up the ledger page. "This is for him. It proves his innocence. And the chancellor's treason." Their laughter died. They were soldiers, not politicians. Treason was a word that cut deeper than any blade. They were uncertain. She stood her ground, patient, unmoving. The standoff stretched. Finally, a voice came from within the room, low and resonant, cutting through the tension. "Let her in?" The guards hesitated, then parted. The heavy door swung inward. Caius stood there, his face pale in the dim light, but his eyes were burning. She walked past him into the room. She did not look at him. She walked to the table and placed the ledger page face up, the soft sound of paper settling on wood. Her part was done. She had brought him the sword. It was up to him to swing it. She turned to leave. His hand shot out, his fingers closing around her wrist. It was not a rough grip. It was a tether. "Alara," he said. It was the first time he had ever used her name. She stopped, but she did not turn around. "Stay," he said. It was not an order. It was a plea. The reckoning was silent. Alara remained in Caius's chambers, a ghost in the corner of a world she had just upended. He had not let go of her wrist until the door was bolted behind them, and then he had simply released her and turned to the ledger page on the table. He stood over it for an hour, unmoving, his stillness more potent than any war cry. The plan he formulated was not one she was privy to. He wrote 2 letters, his script sharp and severe. He sealed one with his own signet ring, which they had not dared take from him. The other he left unsealed. At dawn, he summoned the captain of his personal guard, a man he had handpicked for loyalty, not political connection, through a coded series of knocks on the wall. Through the door, he gave his orders, his voice a low, lethal monotone. He gave the captain the sealed letter for the king and the unsealed one, along with the ledger page for the marshal of the king's army, a man known to despise Valerius. Then they waited. The day passed in an agony of silence. There were no shouts from the courtyard, no sounds of fighting. The tension in the citadel pulled taut, then simply snapped. The guards outside Caius's door, Valerius's men, were replaced in the late afternoon. The new guards, wearing the silver eagle of the king's own, did not look at the door. They faced outward. They were not jailers. They were an honor guard. The news came not as a proclamation, but as an absence. The particular energy of Chancellor Valerius, his perfumed scent, the sound of his ingratiating laugh, the fear he inspired, was gone from the air of the citadel. It was as if he had never been. That evening, Caius came to her. He had been gone for hours, summoned by the king. He returned not in triumph, but in exhaustion. The black uniform of the Lord Commander seemed heavier on his shoulders. He was restored to his position, his name cleared, his authority absolute once more. But he looked hollowed out. He stopped in front of her, where she sat in a chair by the cold hearth. He looked down at her, and she saw the truth of it. He had not been saved by her. He had been witnessed. She had seen him at his most vulnerable, stripped of his power and caged by lies, and she had not run. She had brought him the truth, and in doing so, had seen the part of him that was not the unbreachable Lord Commander, the part that could be broken. That knowledge now lay between them, a devastating intimacy. "He confessed," Caius said, his voice flat. "He chose exile over the axe." He did not say thank you. The words would have been an insult, a reduction of what she had done to a simple favor. What she had done was far more complex and far more costly. She had bound herself to him, not with magic, but with a shared, dangerous truth. She simply nodded, accepting the information. His gaze was heavy, searching her face for something he did not name. "They will see you differently now," he said. "They will see you as mine." He said it like a warning, like a curse. But Alara had been invisible for a decade. Being seen, truly seen by one person, was a power she was just beginning to understand. His chambers were not what she had expected. She had imagined the rooms of the Lord Commander to be filled with maps, weapons, and trophies of war. Instead, they were as stark and Spartan as a monk's cell. A bed, a desk, a table with 2 chairs, and a large, empty hearth. There was no art on the walls, no rugs on the floor. It was the room of a man who owned nothing that could be taken from him, a man who had made a fortress of his own solitude. Now, there were two other heartbeats in the room besides his own. Kal, the shade wolf, lay curled on the stone floor, a pool of living darkness, and her. Caius moved to a heavy wooden chest and retrieved a flint and steel. He knelt and built a fire in the hearth, his movements precise and economical. Soon, a small, hungry flame caught, licking at the kindling before growing into a steady, welcome warmth that began to push back the chill of the stone, the crackle of a new fire. He rose and went to a small cabinet from which he took a dark bottle and two simple earthenware cups. He poured a deep red wine into each. He did not offer her one. He simply walked to the table, set one cup down near the empty chair, and then took the other seat for himself, cradling his own cup in his hands. The sound of something being set down carefully. It was an invitation. It was space, made for her. There was no demand in it, no expectation. It was as quiet and profound as her own act of sitting on the kennel floor. She rose and crossed the room, the worn leather of her boots silent on the stone. She took the seat opposite him. The firelight cast flickering shadows on his face, softening the hard lines but deepening the darkness in his eyes. They sat in a shared, earned stillness. The war with Valerius was over, but the true campaign had just begun. The world would see her as his. She would have to navigate the treacherous currents of the court, a place where she was now a figure of consequence. He would have to learn to command a life that now included someone who had seen past his walls. The silence between them was not empty. It was filled with the weight of her choice, the cost of his victory, and the terrifying, unspoken promise of what came next. She lifted her cup, her eyes meeting his over the rim. For the first time, the stillness in his gaze was not a shield. It was an opening, and in the quiet heart of the citadel, that felt more like a beginning than any victory ever could.